This boy's usual route to school was blocked and he was forced to detour. While riding on an unknown road, he suddenly came across something very strange and decided it was best to call the police. But there was far more to the situation than there let out to be. Ben's parents have trusted him to go to school independently for over a year. He always took the same route and knew it well, but one day the road was closed due to construction and he was forced to take an alternative route. There was a detour and with some hesitation, Ben took it. A detour took him over streets he had never seen before. It was still early morning and the road was very quiet. The fact that it was so quiet calmed him somewhat, as he was a little nervous about taking the detour, and those nerves came back quickly when he noticed something strange. A car stood still in the middle of the road with open doors. As he stared at it, Ben wasn't sure what to do, but the situation intrigued him and his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly but surely, he got closer to the car. Eventually, when Ben was close enough, he heard the motor still running. He looked around in confusion. Why was it running in the middle of the road? Ben got the feeling that something might be wrong, as he didn't see anyone around. He decided to call the police as it seemed the right thing to do. The cops told him they would be right there, and he didn't have to worry. But Ben wasn't worried. He was mainly very curious. The curiosity eventually got the best of him. He couldn't sit still until the police arrived and decided to take a closer look. He was careful not to touch anything as he didn't know how it worked and didn't want to mess anything up. There were some beads in the seam. It looked like they came from a necklace or some sort. Ben shook his head. He had seen stranger things in his parents' car, but now that his mind was focused on the beads, Ben noticed there were more around the car, like some sort of trail. In his mind, there was no other option than that the beads were meant to guide someone somewhere. It was a sign to follow, and acting impulsively, Ben started to follow his instinct and the beads. Ben followed the beads on foot and held his phone in his hand if he needed to call the police again. His imagination was running wild, and he didn't know where the beads would take him or what he would find at the destination, but he was curious to find out. The longer he followed the trail, the harder it became to follow it. At first, the beads stood out on the road, but eventually Ben had to leave the pavement and didn't walk on the grass. He also noticed that the beads became more sporadic the longer he followed, but he managed to stay on track. When Ben looked up, he saw an abandoned-looking factory, which gave him the creeps. He hesitated about what to do next. Doubtfully, he moved closer to the building, and that's when he noticed it. Near the door, he saw the remains of the beaded necklace on the ground, but that wasn't all. Pieces of fabric were beside it looking like they came from clothing. It gave him an eerie feeling. Why did the trail suddenly stop here, and why were there ripped pieces of clothing? Thinking this was something the police would like to know, he tried to call the cops again, but his call failed. When he looked at his phone, he noticed he had no service. There was one thing he could do. Ben retraced his steps as fast as possible and ran back to the car, hoping the police were already there, and he felt relieved when he saw the officers. Who would have guessed his day would be so exciting? But it was far from over. Ben arrived at the car breathlessly and surprised the officers. Where did he go, and why was he so out of breath? When Ben recovered, he explained what he had found and urged the police officers to come with him. He took a few deep breaths and ran back to the building, guiding the officers. Not sure what to make of the boy's story, the officers followed hesitantly, but they soon noticed the trail Ben spoke of, and when they arrived, they saw the beaded necklace and pieces of ripped clothing. Ben was happy that the officers agreed this was worth investigating and watched them enter the building. Ben waited outside anxiously, letting his imagination run wild on what was happening inside. He hoped he guided the police officers to someone in need and help arrive just in time due to his help. But then the officers reappeared. Ben approached them and was hopeful they would tell him an amazing story, but to his disappointment, that was far from it. They said they searched the whole building and told the young boy it was clear. Nothing out of the ordinary, one of them said, but things couldn't be further from the truth. The police officers asked Ben to return to the abandoned car and explain everything that happened. The young boy answered all their questions, but while he did, his mind was somewhere else. He couldn't stop thinking about the factory. And when the officers told him he could leave, Ben knew exactly where to go. Because when he grabbed his bike, Ben went directly back to the factory. Initially, the building scared him, but the officers searched the place and found it safe, and when he arrived, the door was already half open. It was too tempting for him to stay outside. What could go wrong? The young boy's eyes opened wide as he stepped inside, and his steps echoed through the huge hall. It looked like there hadn't been people here in decades. A shiver ran down his spine as a mixture of nerves and curiosity filled his body. The young boy walked through the factory, subconsciously looking for beads and pieces of fabric. He imagined the factory was still active, the hall filled with lots of workers making a bunch of noise, but then his imagination suddenly became a reality as his thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound. It took a while before Ben fully realized the sound was real. His body froze in place and he held his breath. Was it real or was it inside his head? But no, there it was again. A faint sound repeating itself over and over again, and then suddenly silence. The young boy pricked his ears, trying to figure out where the sound came from or what the noise even was, but he couldn't figure out what it could possibly be. Ben's curiosity skyrocketed as he wanted nothing more than to figure out where the sound originated from and what was making it. Ben slowly made his way through the factory, focusing all his attention on the sound. Every time he heard the noise, he stopped moving and listened. It was hard to pinpoint the origin as it echoed through the massive hall, but eventually he noticed it was becoming louder. His ears guided him toward the back of the factory, and when Ben entered a small corridor filled with doors on either side, the sound became apparent. His heartbeat quickened, and his body tensed up as he walked through the hallway, trying to pinpoint the exact location. But then he suddenly halted. When he passed one of the doors, he suddenly heard the sound behind him. It was clear this was the origin of the noise, but as he stood before it, Ben could also make out an additional sound, something that worried him. It sounded like people were behind the door, but he wasn't entirely sure. Ben tried to open the door, but it seemed stuck in place. "Is someone there?" he asked in a quivering voice. A silence followed, which seemed to last forever, but then Ben gasped as his fear was confirmed. There were people on the other side of this door. He heard their voices, but they sounded unusual to him. He tried to open the door again. He had to get inside. Ben pulled the door with all his might, and to his delight, the door finally opened. When he stepped inside, he noticed the door handle was missing. The voices were louder but still sounded strange to Ben, and when his eyes finally adjusted to the darkness in the room, he understood why they sounded so weird. Before him lay a family, their hands and legs bound together, and their voices sounded muffled because they were gagged. Ben didn't believe what he was seeing, think it would turn out like this. The police were the ones that had to find the people in need. It took the young boy some time to process everything, but then he moved into action, untying the scared family. Within moments, the family was untied and able to talk. The mother and daughter's daughter sobbed and embraced Ben, not knowing how to thank him, but the father brought everyone back to reality. "We aren't free yet. We have to get out of here before they come back," he urged everyone. The comment scared Ben. He hadn't thought about why the people were tied up or who had done it, let alone that the culprits could still be in the area. The young boy's sudden fear controlled his body, and he guided the family out of the factory as fast as he could. Slowly, panic and fear took control over the whole group, but when they set foot outside the factory, they couldn't help but feel a little relief. But what now? They didn't know where the culprits were or if they were coming. Then Ben remembered the officers. "Follow me," he yelled. The family put all their faith in the young boy and followed him trustfully. Ben ran as fast as he could toward the car he found that morning and hoped with all his heart the police would still be there. And when he saw they were, his heart jumped. The police showed confused faces when they saw the panicked group running toward them. But the father quickly explained this was their car and they had been driving here this morning when a group suddenly forced them to stop, after which they forcefully grabbed him and his family and took them somewhere. "We had no idea where they were taking us," the father explained. He continued by saying that eventually they were thrown into a dark, musky room and were bound and gagged. But one question remained unanswered for the police. "Why did they take you? What did they want from you?" the officers asked, but they didn't know. "Probably ransom," the father guessed. "The criminals left immediately after bringing them to the factory, but I did hear one of them say that they would return sooner than later," the father said. While one of the officers took care of the family and Ben, the other one called for assistance. He explained the urgency of the situation, and within minutes, backup had arrived. The officers asked Ben where they needed to go, and with his instructions, they successfully arrived at the corridor. 3 police officers took position inside the room. They let themselves get locked in, but they were in constant communication with the rest of the team, which would stay in the area and provide backup. As after a few hours, a group of people showed up and entered the factory. They looked around suspiciously and made their way toward the corridor, unaware of the surprise they would get. "Hands where we can see them and face the wall," they yelled. Moments later, the other police officers came to assist. The culprits were arrested without problems and taken to the station. Ben and the family were also taken to the station, where the family confirmed these were the people who forced them out of their car and took them. The mother and daughter had difficulty seeing the criminals again, but were happy they were caught. With the confirmation, the police could build a case against them. Because the criminals were caught red-handed and there were multiple witnesses, the case was built pretty fast, and the following week, the criminals stood trial. Thanks to the statements from the family and Ben, the jury decided on a long prison sentence for all culprits. They weren't harming anyone anytime soon. When the trial was over, the family approached Ben and couldn't thank him enough. As a final gesture, they invite the boy and his family over for dinner, which results in a strong friendship between the families. Because the parents stayed in touch and Ben became good friends with the daughter.